James Anderson, the CEO of a tech company, seemed to have it all. A successful career, a mansion, and a beautiful wife, Sarah. They had been married for 8 years. Welcome to another amazing story on Mr. Kelin Stories, the place where gripping tales come to life. If you love stories full of twists, turns, and powerful lessons, you've come to the right spot. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on any new adventures. Your support means the world to me. If you enjoy the stories, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and feel free to leave your thoughts and comments below. I always love hearing from you and connecting with this incredible community. Now dive into the story, feel the emotions, and don't forget to share your thoughts. James Anderson, the CEO of a fast-growing tech company, was everything anyone could dream of: successful, powerful, and wealthy. From the outside, he seemed to have it all: a beautiful wife, Sarah, a luxurious mansion in the heart of the city, and a seemingly perfect life. People admired him, envied him, and often praised him for the successful empire he had built. But behind the glittering facade of his success was a story that no one could see, and that story was his marriage. For the first few years of their marriage, everything was blissful. James adored Sarah, and Sarah loved him deeply. They were a team. She supported him through the long hours, the endless meetings, and the tireless pressure of his career. She was his rock, his best friend. But somewhere along the way, things started to change. The late nights at the office became longer, the business trips became more frequent, and the communication between them began to dwindle. Sarah started to notice the change. The small gestures of affection that used to brighten her day were now a distant memory. He had stopped noticing her. The way her smile used to light up a room, or the way she would laugh at his corny jokes. Every evening, Sarah would wait for him to come home, but when he finally did, it was as if he wasn't truly there. His mind was always somewhere else, on his meetings, his investors, his clients. She would try to talk to him, to share how her day went or ask how his day had been, but his responses were always short. "I'm tired, Sarah. Can we talk about it later?" he would say. And before long, he'd be glued to his laptop or phone, checking emails, responding to messages. In her quiet heart, Sarah understood. She understood that his work was demanding, that the pressure of his success was immense. But she also felt forgotten, invisible. She was no longer the priority she once had been, the beautiful woman he had once complimented daily, the woman who used to fill his thoughts, had become just another fixture in his life. She was now just his wife, someone who no longer mattered as much as his work. Sarah tried everything she could think of. She cooked his favorite meals, wore the dress he had once adored, and even planned romantic evenings. But nothing seemed to reach him. He never seemed to notice. Slowly, she withdrew into herself. The once vibrant, confident woman who had loved him so fiercely was now a shell of her former self. But she couldn't bring herself to say anything. After all, how could she? He was the successful CEO. What right did she have to complain? As the days turned into months, Sarah's loneliness grew. The house felt colder without his attention, and the silence between them became more suffocating. The sparkle in her eyes began to fade, and the laughter in her heart became a rare sound. She started to feel like an invisible figure in her own life, existing only as a background character to the world around her. James, on the other hand, remained oblivious to the changes happening right before his eyes. His career consumed him. He was constantly working, always moving forward, and in the whirlwind of his ambition, he didn't see the woman he had promised to cherish, to love. He didn't see the pain behind her smile, the tears she wiped away when he wasn't looking, or the exhaustion in her voice when she tried to reach out. He didn't see the way she began to drift, quietly and silently, into a place where she was no longer his priority. Then, one day, Sarah stood before the mirror, staring at the woman looking back at her. She didn't recognize her anymore. She had become a shadow of the woman she once was, a woman who had once dreamed of adventures, of love, of a life filled with joy. She had let herself fade into the background, allowing the demands of her husband's life to take center stage. A part of her wondered, is this all there is? Is this the life I've signed up for? The thought was painful, and yet it lingered. She had sacrificed so much for him, for their life together, but in doing so, she had lost herself. It wasn't fair. She wasn't sure who she had become, but she knew one thing: she deserved more than this. She deserved to be seen, to be heard, to be loved. That night, as James came home later than usual, Sarah sat alone in their dimly lit living room. The house was eerily quiet, and her thoughts swirled in the emptiness of the space. She had become a ghost in her own home. She thought about the love they once shared, the laughter, the promises. The dream of a life together had slowly turned into something that felt more like a prison, but as she sat there, a flicker of hope began to grow inside her. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe, just maybe, she could find herself again. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for her to make a decision that would change everything. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the pen and paper, writing down a single note to James. It wasn't a cry for attention. It wasn't a demand. It was a simple truth, a message from the heart. I'm doing this for both of us. I need time. Don't try to find me. Love, Sarah. The note would be her first step toward reclaiming her life. It was time for Sarah to be seen. It was time for her to find her own path, whether James walked with her or not. In the silence of their expansive home, Sarah's heart echoed with the weight of her unspoken pain. The vast, empty rooms seemed to amplify the loneliness that had slowly crept into her life. Once a bustling and joyful space filled with shared laughter and warmth, their home now felt more like a gilded cage, beautifully decorated, yet devoid of the one thing that truly mattered: love. The love they once shared had faded like an old photograph left out in the sun, its colors dimming with time. Every day, Sarah put on her best smile, masking the hurt and longing she felt deep inside. She cooked his favorite meals, kept the house pristine, and made sure everything was in place, hoping that one day, maybe today, James would notice her, would see her. But the truth was, James had become lost in his world of power, deadlines, and endless meetings. His attention was consumed by his company's demands, and she had become just another fixture in the background of his life. A person who existed, but was no longer truly seen. It was in the quiet moments, when she would sit alone in their living room, staring out the window at the world passing by, that Sarah felt the ache in her chest. The ache that came from the realization that no matter how much she did, no matter how hard she tried to get his attention, it was never enough. She felt like a ghost in her own marriage, fading more and more with each passing day. It wasn't just the lack of his presence. It was the lack of his attention. She had become a stranger to him, a person he could no longer truly connect with. His life had moved on, and she was being left behind in the wake of his ambition. The silence between them was deafening, louder than any argument or fight could ever be. She would sit beside him at the dinner table, watching as he scrolled through his phone, his mind clearly elsewhere. She had tried to start conversations, asking him about his day or how he was feeling, but his responses were always the same. "I'm just busy, Sarah. You know how it is." His words were empty now, like a ritualistic response he had grown accustomed to, a way of brushing off the real issues between them. But what Sarah heard in those words wasn't just an excuse, it was a cold dismissal. It was a signal that she no longer mattered. There were nights when Sarah would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with the thoughts she couldn't express. "Why don't you see me, James?" she would ask silently, her heart aching with the weight of the unasked question, "Why can't you hear me when I need you?" But the answer never came. He was always too busy, too absorbed in his work to notice the cracks forming in their marriage. She longed for him, not just physically, but emotionally. She missed the days when they would talk for hours, laugh together, share their dreams and fears. But now, those conversations seemed like a distant memory, locked away in a part of her heart she wasn't sure she could reach anymore. And so, Sarah withdrew. She stopped fighting for his attention. She stopped asking him to notice her because it had become too painful. She began to retreat into herself, burying her feelings deep inside. Every word he spoke that wasn't about her felt like a reminder of her invisibility. Every time he left for work, every time he stayed out late, or every time he spent another weekend working on a project, it felt like a rejection. The more she gave, the less she received. The love she had once felt for him began to fade, replaced by a cold, unspoken bitterness. She tried to push it aside, to convince herself that everything would get better, that things would go back to the way they were, but in the quiet of her solitude, she couldn't deny the truth anymore. The loneliness she felt was suffocating. It wasn't just about being alone in a house filled with things. It was the emotional emptiness that weighed her down. There were moments when she'd sit by the window, watching the world go by, and wonder if anyone else felt as alone as she did. The ache in her chest became a constant companion, one she carried silently throughout her days. She would smile at friends, pretend everything was fine, but inside she was falling apart. She longed for the touch of his hand, for the sound of his voice in a conversation that wasn't just about business, for the warmth of a hug that wasn't rushed or distracted, but James never seemed to notice. He would kiss her forehead as he left for work in the morning, but it was always mechanical, like something he had to do because it was expected of him, not because he actually wanted to. He would come home late, barely acknowledging her presence, and then retreat into his office, leaving her to her own thoughts. She had stopped waiting for him to come to her because she realized deep down he never would. She would remain invisible, just a part of the background noise of his life, while he continued to climb higher in his career, his attention focused solely on his success. And yet, despite the overwhelming loneliness, despite the feeling that she was being erased from the world they had built together, Sarah refused to give up. She refused to accept that this was the end of their story. She still loved him. She still saw the man she had married, the man she had once adored, buried somewhere beneath the layers of stress and ambition. She wasn't ready to walk away, not yet. She had to believe that there was a way back, that they could find each other again. But how could she reach him? How could she make him see what was happening before it was too late? The question swirled in her mind, unanswered and heavy. She didn't know the answers, but one thing was certain. She wasn't going to let this silent struggle define her forever. She wasn't going to let the emptiness swallow her whole. If she had to fight for their love, she would. She had always been strong, and she wasn't about to give up now. The fight wasn't just for their marriage, it was for herself, for the woman she used to be, for the woman she had lost in the shadows of his success. It was time for her to find her voice again. It was time for her to make him see her, not as the quiet woman standing in the background of his life, but as the woman he had once promised to cherish. The journey ahead would be difficult, but Sarah knew that if she didn't take control now, if she didn't fight for herself, she might lose everything she had ever cared about. And so, with a resolve she hadn't felt in years, Sarah decided it was time for change. No more silently suffering in the shadows of a life that was no longer her own. It was time for her to be seen again. It was yet another evening spent alone in the house that used to hum with the sounds of shared laughter and love. Sarah sat on the couch, staring blankly at the empty space across from her where James should have been. She ran her fingers over the edge of the cushion, remembering when they used to sit there together, talking for hours, with no interruptions, just the two of them. But now that empty spot seemed like a void, one that mirrored the emptiness she felt inside. The silence of the house was deafening, and it had become her constant companion. It was a silence that spoke volumes about the distance between her and the man she loved. She had tried everything she could think of. She had cooked his favorite meals, planned romantic weekends, and made subtle attempts to reconnect with him. But nothing worked. James, with his high-powered job and his obsession with climbing the corporate ladder, seemed unreachable. She had long ago stopped pleading for his attention, stopped demanding that he notice her, and yet her heart continued to ache. She had tried to ignore it, to convince herself that this was just a phase, that things would get better once his business settled down. But deep down, Sarah knew better. This was not just a phase. This was their reality now. As the night dragged on, Sarah found herself staring out the large window of their living room, watching the world outside, the city lights twinkling like distant stars. She had once been part of that world, full of dreams and ambitions of her own, a woman who believed in the power of love and the strength of connection. But now she felt like an outsider in her own life. She had let everything slip away, allowing her marriage to become a one-sided affair. She had lost herself in the process of trying to save a relationship that seemed beyond saving. She had given so much of herself that there was nothing left. That evening, as she sat in the stillness, a thought began to take root in her mind, a thought that had been quietly building for weeks, even months. It was a thought that terrified her at first, but also, oddly enough, filled her with a sense of hope. What if I took control of my own life again? What if I stopped waiting for James to change and started changing for myself? For so long, Sarah had been waiting for him to see her, to love her, to notice that she was fading away. But now, as she thought about it, she realized something crucial. She had been waiting for someone else to make her happy, to fix her life, and she had forgotten the one person who held the power to change it all. It was her. She had the power. She had always had the power. A sense of clarity washed over her. She didn't need to wait for James to come around. She didn't need to beg for his attention anymore. It was time for her to take action, to do something that would shake her life from its roots and allow her to rediscover who she truly was. Sarah had always been strong, but she had allowed the weight of the marriage to drain that strength. She had given too much and received too little. But now she was going to take back her life. She was going to remind herself of who she was, of what she was capable of, and of the woman she had once been, before she lost herself in the shadows of their relationship. And so that evening, as the stars twinkled outside her window, Sarah began to plan. The plan wasn't just for her. It was for their marriage as well. It wasn't about running away from her problems. It was about running toward something that would help her find herself again. It was a journey, both physical and emotional, that would force her to face her own fears, to reconnect with the woman she had been before her life had become consumed by James's world. She thought about it for a long time. Where could she go? What could she do? The answer came to her slowly, almost like a whisper in the wind. She needed to go somewhere that would give her the space to breathe, the freedom to think, and the opportunity to rediscover the passion and the fire that had once defined her. It had been years since she had taken a trip by herself, just for herself. The thought of traveling alone terrified her, but at the same time, it filled her with excitement. This is it, she thought. This is what I need. Sarah began researching places she could go, places where she could escape the overwhelming weight of her life. She knew she didn't want to be surrounded by luxury or distractions. She needed to be somewhere raw, somewhere peaceful. After hours of searching, she finally settled on a remote retreat in the mountains, a place known for its solitude and beauty. It was the perfect escape, a place where she could disconnect from the noise of the world and reconnect with herself. But this trip wasn't just about her. It was also about their marriage. She knew that she couldn't keep living like this, quietly suffering in a marriage that had lost its spark. She didn't want to just run away. She wanted to return stronger, more self-assured, and more confident than ever before. She needed this time to heal, to rediscover her passions, and to figure out what she truly wanted from life. And maybe, just maybe, she would return with a clearer sense of what her future with James could look like, if there even was a future. As Sarah made the final plans for her trip, she realized just how much she had been holding back. She had spent so much time trying to please James, trying to hold their marriage together, that she had lost sight of her own needs. She had let herself fade into the background of her own life, afraid to take a step that might upset the delicate balance they had created. But now she was ready to shake things up. She was ready to find herself again, to reclaim the woman she had been before she became so consumed with trying to make her marriage work. The next day, Sarah booked her trip, feeling a rush of excitement and fear in equal measure. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back now. She was going to do this for herself. She was going to go to the mountains, and for the first time in years, she was going to breathe deeply, without the weight of expectation or the heaviness of loneliness. As she packed her bags, Sarah realized something else, something that filled her with both sadness and hope. She had spent so long waiting for James to notice her, to love her the way she needed to be loved, but in the end, the only person who could make that happen was her. It wasn't about his approval. It wasn't about him changing or coming around. It was about her learning to love herself again. She wasn't going to wait for him anymore. She was going to take her life into her own hands, and whatever happened after that, whether they found their way back to each other or not, she knew she would be okay. Her journey was just beginning, and though it was filled with uncertainty, it was also filled with possibility. She was stepping into the unknown. But this time, she wasn't afraid. She was ready to find herself, to heal, and to figure out what she truly wanted in life, whether or not that included James. The turning point had come. Sarah was no longer a passive observer in her own life. She was the one driving the change now, and nothing, not even her own doubts, could stop her. James woke up to the soft hum of his alarm clock ringing through the otherwise quiet house. The morning light filtered in through the curtains, casting a gentle glow across the room. But as he opened his eyes, something felt off. There was a stillness in the air, a silence that felt heavier than usual. The warmth he had come to associate with Sarah's presence, her soft breathing beside him, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the sheets, was absent. He turned to his side, expecting to see her there, asleep under the covers, as she had been countless mornings before. But the bed was empty. The space beside him, cold and untouched, felt like a stark contrast to the warmth of the night they had spent just a few hours earlier. A wave of confusion washed over him, and he sat up, rubbing his eyes as he tried to shake off the disorienting feeling that something was wrong. "Sarah!" he called out, his voice hushed at first, like he was expecting to hear her soft laugh or her sleepy response. But the house remained silent. It was too quiet. A surge of unease rippled through him as he glanced around the room, searching for any sign of her. But there was nothing, no sign that she had even been there. Her side of the bed was made, and the house seemed almost unnaturally pristine, as if everything had been carefully put in its place. His heart began to race as he got out of bed and hurried to the bathroom. The door was open, and the light flickered from the cracked doorframe. "Empty," he called out again, this time louder. "Sarah, where are you?" The silence stretched, and a sinking feeling filled his chest. His mind was spinning. He moved quickly through the house, checking every room. The kitchen, the living room, the study. Each room was empty, untouched. Her belongings, the ones that had always been scattered around the house, were nowhere to be found. Her shoes were gone from the entryway, her coat absent from the hook by the door. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. His pulse quickened as he turned back to the bedroom. He checked the closet, but the shelves were bare. Her clothes, the ones that had once filled the closet with color and life, were gone. His heart began to pound, and panic slowly crept in, gnawing at him from the inside out. What was going on? Why was everything so still, so empty? Where had she gone? Then his eyes fell on the small folded piece of paper that sat on the bed, placed carefully on top of the pillow where she had been lying just hours ago. James's stomach tightened. He reached for it, hands trembling as he unfolded the note. His eyes skimmed over the words, and as he read, a wave of dread washed over him. "I'm doing this for both of us. I need time. Don't try to find me. Love, Sarah." The words burned into his mind, each one sharp and final, like a cold, hard slap. For a moment, James simply stared at the note, unable to comprehend what he was reading. His mind raced to process the message, but no matter how many times he read it, the meaning didn't change. Sarah had left. She was gone, and she didn't want him to find her. He could feel the panic rising within him like a storm, threatening to swallow him whole. His breath caught in his throat, and he suddenly felt like he couldn't breathe. His heart pounded erratically in his chest as he scrambled to grab his phone from the bedside table. His fingers were shaking as he dialed her number, but after a few rings, the call went straight to voicemail. He dialed again, and again, the same result. Her voicemail message was cold and impersonal, offering no comfort, no reassurance. "Sarah, please, pick up," he muttered under his breath, his voice strained with desperation, but the phone remained silent. The buzzing of his calls filled the room, amplifying the crushing weight of the silence. Panic surged within him, mingling with a deep sense of regret. How had he missed this? How had he not seen that something was wrong? He had been so consumed by his work, by his endless responsibilities, that he had failed to notice the subtle signs that Sarah was slipping away. He had taken her for granted, assuming that she would always be there, always waiting for him to come around. But now, in the wake of her absence, the truth hit him like a freight train. He had pushed her to the edge. He had neglected her, dismissed her needs, and in doing so he had pushed her to a breaking point. She had been silently screaming for his attention, for his love, and he had ignored her. And now she was gone. "How could I have been so blind?" he asked himself, his voice breaking with the weight of his own guilt. James felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he stumbled back, sitting heavily on the edge of the bed. His mind was spinning, his thoughts a chaotic jumble of questions and regrets. Where had she gone? What was she doing? Had she left for good? Was this the end of their marriage? The realization hit him hard. He didn't even know who she was anymore. He had let her slip through his fingers, and now she was gone, leaving him with nothing but the hollow echo of the life they had once shared. For the first time in years, James felt an overwhelming sense of fear, something he had never experienced in his high-powered career. He had been fearless in the boardroom, resolute and decisive in every business deal, but now he was paralyzed. The woman he loved, the woman who had stood by his side through it all, was no longer in his life. And the worst part was that he didn't know how to fix it. He tried calling her friends, her family, anyone who might know where she had gone. But every call was met with the same response. No one knew. It was as if Sarah had vanished without a trace. His mind raced through the possibilities. Was she safe? Was she angry with him? Was she planning to come back, or had she truly left for good? The more he thought about it, the more his fear turned into regret. Why hadn't I seen it coming? He could remember the moments when Sarah had tried to reach out, her subtle hints that something was wrong. She had stopped asking for his attention because she had given up, and now her absence was the loudest statement of all. James sank deeper into the weight of his own mistakes. This wasn't just about Sarah leaving. It was about his failure to appreciate her, to see her as more than just the woman standing in the background of his life. He had taken her for granted, and now she was gone. The pain in his chest was almost unbearable as he realized that this could be the end of everything they had built together. But even as he sat there, lost in his own guilt and despair, a flicker of something else stirred within him. It was a small spark, a faint glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end. Maybe there's still a chance to make things right. But as quickly as the thought came, it was overshadowed by his overwhelming sense of fear. Time was running out, and Sarah was out there, somewhere, refusing to let him find her. For the first time in years, James didn't know what to do. All he knew was that he had to find her. And that thought, mixed with the weight of his regret, pushed him to the edge. This was his last chance, and he couldn't afford to mess it up. James had always prided himself on being in control. In the boardroom, he was the one who called the shots, the one who made things happen. In his professional life, he had built an empire from the ground up. He had mastered the art of negotiation, of handling pressure, and of keeping everything running smoothly. But now, in the most personal moment of his life, control had slipped from his grasp like sand through his fingers. That morning, after discovering Sarah's disappearance, James was a man undone. The world he had once carefully constructed, the life he had so meticulously planned, felt as fragile as glass. Sarah was gone. His wife, the woman he had spent years with, had walked out without a trace. The note she had left him, simple and to the point, was all the explanation he had. But the more he read it, the more questions swirled in his mind, questions that had no answers. "I'm doing this for both of us. I need time. Don't try to find me. Love, Sarah." Her words haunted him as he scrambled to understand what had happened, why she had left, and why she had left without telling him where she was going. The unanswered questions gnawed at him, digging deeper with every passing second. His heart raced in a way that was unfamiliar to him. He had been on high-stakes business calls where he was cool and composed, dealing with multi-million-dollar deals without a flicker of doubt. But this was different. He felt panic settling in, his thoughts scattered like leaves in a storm. Sarah had left him, and he had no idea where to turn. How had it come to this? The first thing James did was pick up his phone. His hands were shaking as he dialed her closest friends, Lily, Jenna, and Claire, hoping they might have heard something, anything that would lead him to Sarah. He needed to know where she was, needed to understand why she had done this. He needed to fix it, to fix what he had broken. But each call only deepened his sense of helplessness. "James, I haven't heard from Sarah." Lily's voice was strained with concern. "I thought she was fine. She seemed fine the last time I saw her, but I haven't spoken to her in days. Are you sure she's gone?" James felt his stomach drop. Lily was one of Sarah's closest friends. If she hadn't heard from her, then no one had. Had Sarah been planning this for a while? He wondered. Had she been slipping away slowly, silently, while I was too wrapped up in myself to notice? He ended the call with Lily and immediately tried Jenna. She answered after the second ring, but there was no sense of certainty in her voice. "I haven't heard from her either, James. She's just gone. I don't know what's going on, but this isn't like Sarah. She's not someone to just disappear without telling anyone." Her words felt like a slap, but he kept his composure, hiding the desperation creeping up his spine. "Do you know where she could have gone?" he asked, his voice tight with emotion. Jenna paused. "I'm sorry, James, I don't." But maybe she just needs time to think. You should give her space. She's been really overwhelmed lately. Space. Overwhelmed. The word stung. He knew Sarah had been struggling, but he had never truly understood the depth of her pain, the loneliness she had been carrying. In his mind, he had always believed she would be there, waiting for him, patient and understanding. But he had been blind to her suffering, too focused on his own life and ambitions to notice hers. As the day dragged on, James's mind raced from one possibility to another. His calls to family members, to her colleagues, to everyone who could have known where Sarah had gone, brought no answers. No one knew anything. Her phone continued to go straight to voicemail. He tried calling again and again, each time feeling the weight of her absence more acutely. It wasn't just the uncertainty that was crushing him. It was the realization that he had failed her. This is my fault, he thought again and again. He had failed as a husband. He had taken her love for granted, assuming she would always be there, assuming that she could handle his neglect. He had let his work, his ambitions, consume him while she silently suffered in the background. He sat down in the study, his eyes scanning the room, the familiar surroundings now feeling foreign and cold. The home that had once been a sanctuary of love now felt like a cage. His mind wandered back to the countless moments when Sarah had tried to get his attention, when she had made the effort to talk to him, to connect with him. And each time he had brushed her off, too focused on his own pursuits to notice the cracks forming in their relationship. His eyes landed on a picture frame, a photograph of their wedding day, a moment frozen in time when they had been so happy, so in love. It felt like a different life, a different James. Where did I go wrong? He thought bitterly. Why didn't I see this coming? The weight of his regrets pressed down on him as the afternoon turned into evening. He made one final call, this time to Sarah's mother, hoping for any kind of lead, any piece of information that might point him in the right direction. I haven't heard from her, James. I'm worried. This isn't like Sarah at all. She would never just disappear without telling someone. I think something's wrong. Please find her. The desperation in her mother's voice mirrored his own. But no matter how many calls he made or how many people he reached out to, no one knew where Sarah had gone. The feeling of helplessness continued to grow. James stared out the window of the study, watching as the city lights flickered in the distance. The familiar buzz of activity outside seemed so distant, so irrelevant to the turmoil he was feeling inside. He had been so consumed with his work that he had neglected the woman he had promised to love forever. Now she was gone, and the cold realization that she might never return was settling in. The hours stretched on, and James's sense of urgency only deepened. He couldn't sit idly by, waiting for Sarah to reach out to him. He needed to find her. He needed to make things right. It was in that moment that he made a decision. He would stop at nothing to find her. He would do whatever it took to make up for the years of neglect, the years he had spent blind to her needs, her pain, and her love. I will find you, Sarah. I will make it right. James wasn't sure how he was going to do it, but he knew that this was his last chance. If he had any hope of saving their marriage, of getting her back, he had to find her first. And that meant searching in every corner, every place, and leaving no stone unturned. His life, as he had known it, had been built on precision and control. Now, as he searched for his wife, he was more uncertain than ever, but one thing was clear: he couldn't afford to fail. Days passed into weeks, and still, Sarah remained out of reach. James felt the time slip through his fingers like grains of sand, every minute without news from her dragging him deeper into despair. He had scoured every place she might have gone, sent countless messages, and even hired a private investigator to help track her down. Every call he made, every lead he followed, ended in frustration. He couldn't find her. He was drowning in the sea of regret, weighed down by the realization that he had let the most important person in his life slip away. The loneliness in their massive home seemed more suffocating each day. The rooms that had once echoed with laughter and love now felt eerily silent. James had always been driven by his success, his desire for power, his ambition. But now, as the emptiness of his life pressed in on him, he realized that his achievements, his wealth, his title, none of it meant anything without Sarah. Her absence was a constant ache in his chest, a dull, relentless throb that he couldn't shake. The idea that she had moved on, that she was out there living a life without him, gnawed at his soul. His mind kept returning to the note she had left him. "I need time. Don't try to find me." It was clear she had meant every word. She didn't want him looking for her, didn't want him invading her space. The finality of those words stung, but he also knew, deep down, that he had brought this upon himself. Each morning, he woke up hoping for a breakthrough, an answer, something that would give him a glimmer of hope. But the weeks wore on, and the silence was deafening. It was as though Sarah had vanished completely, taking every ounce of warmth from their shared life. James spent his days in his office, staring at the piles of work that no longer held any meaning. The phone calls from colleagues seemed distant, irrelevant. He couldn't focus on anything but Sarah. Then, one evening, something unexpected happened. James was sitting at his desk, half-heartedly going through emails, when a subject line caught his eye. Sarah. Women's Empowerment Conference Invitation. His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't heard from her in so long. His pulse quickened as he clicked open the email, his fingers trembling slightly. A few seconds later, the words on the screen hit him like a lightning bolt. "Dear James, I hope this email finds you well. I wanted to reach out and let you know that I've been invited to speak at the upcoming Women's Empowerment Conference in New York. I'm honored to share that I've been chosen as one of the keynote speakers for the event, and I'll be telling my story of strength, independence, and overcoming adversity. This opportunity means a lot to me, and I truly feel like I'm on the right path now. I've spent so much of my life in the shadows of others, putting everyone else's needs above my own. But I've come to realize that I need to live for myself, to embrace my own voice, and to encourage other women to do the same. It's time for me to take my life back. I wanted to let you know about this, even though I'm sure you may be surprised. It's not just about the conference. It's about reclaiming my power and finding the strength I had forgotten I had. This is my moment, and I'm ready to seize it. I hope you understand that this is something I need to do for me. I need to be the woman I was always meant to be, and I need to do this on my own. Take care." Sarah James sat back in his chair, the weight of the email pressing down on him. He read it over and over again, the words slowly sinking in. Sarah, the woman who had always been by his side, the one he had taken for granted for so long, was thriving without him. The shock hit him like a wave crashing against the shore. Sarah was no longer the quiet, supportive wife who had waited for him to come around. She was now a woman who had found her voice, who had stepped into her own power and was inspiring others to do the same. The realization was humbling. James had always thought of Sarah as the one who needed him, the one who was waiting for him to change. But in truth, it was him who had been waiting for her to wake up and claim her life back. And now she had. A mix of emotions swirled within him: pride, regret, admiration, and sorrow. Pride for the woman Sarah had become, for the strength she had found in herself. But regret for the years he had spent neglecting her, for the years he had failed to see how capable she was on her own. He had been so blind, so caught up in his own world, that he hadn't noticed her strength, her potential. But now, as he read the email, he couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Sarah was no longer waiting for him to fix things. She was fixing herself, and in doing so, she had become something entirely new, something he could no longer take for granted. As he sat there, the weight of it all pressing down on him, James felt a deep, overwhelming sense of loss. But there was something else there too, something he hadn't expected, a flicker of hope. Sarah was out there, standing tall, doing what she had always deserved to do. And though it was painful, he knew that this was a moment of reckoning for him. This was his wake-up call. If he truly wanted to make things right, he would have to change, not for her, but for himself. Sarah had done the work to find her strength. Now, James had to find his. The next few days were a blur of mixed emotions for James. He thought about Sarah's words constantly. "I need to be the woman I was always meant to be." It was clear that Sarah had been searching for herself all along. He had simply been too wrapped up in his own selfishness to see it, but now she had found what she had been looking for, and it was far beyond him. The email had been a shock, yes, but it was also an epiphany. Sarah was thriving. She was no longer the woman who stood silently in the background. She had stepped into the light, found her purpose, and was now helping others find theirs. And James, he was left to confront his own truth. He had lost the woman he loved because he had failed to see her worth. But in that realization, there was a glimmer of hope, a chance to redeem himself, not in her eyes, but in his own. James knew that if there was any chance of rebuilding what he had lost, he had to prove to Sarah that he could be the man she had always deserved. But he also knew that he couldn't do it by trying to control the situation or by forcing her to come back to him. He had to respect her journey, honor her strength, and give her the space to continue growing. It was no longer about finding Sarah. It was about finding himself. And maybe, just maybe, in doing so, he could find a way back to her. James had been running on fumes for days, each hour weighed down by his guilt and desperation. He had made up his mind to attend the Women's Empowerment Conference in New York, a decision fueled by the need to see Sarah again, to beg for her forgiveness, to tell her how much he had changed, and to apologize for the countless ways he had failed her. His heart was pounding as he boarded the plane, hoping against hope that he could convince Sarah to give their marriage another chance. He had to make it right, no matter the cost. He wasn't sure what he expected when he arrived, but it certainly wasn't the overwhelming sense of awe that washed over him when he first walked into the venue. The conference was massive, filled with women from all walks of life, each one brimming with stories of resilience, strength, and triumph. It was a sea of powerful voices, all echoing with the same message: you are enough. And yet, even amidst the throngs of confident, successful women, there was one voice that stood out above all the rest. James had heard of Sarah's keynote speech, but hearing it in person, that was something else entirely. He stood in the back of the room, his eyes scanning the stage, his pulse racing. The lights were dimmed as the speaker before Sarah finished her presentation, and then, as if the world slowed down, Sarah walked onto the stage. She wore a soft blue dress that accentuated the strength in her posture, the poise in her every movement. She was no longer the woman who stood quietly by his side, waiting for him to acknowledge her. This was a woman who owned the room, who had stepped into her power in a way James could hardly comprehend. She stood tall behind the podium, and the audience erupted into applause. But it wasn't just the applause that struck James. It was the energy radiating from Sarah. She was glowing, not with the expectation of approval, but with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're capable of. Sarah took the microphone and smiled at the crowd. Her eyes, for a brief moment, met James's. There was no sign of recognition, no sign of emotion in her gaze, just a calm, collected strength. It wasn't the Sarah he had known, The woman who once looked at him for guidance, for reassurance. This Sarah was different. This Sarah didn't need him. She had everything she needed within herself. And then she spoke. "Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so honored to be here today." Her voice was steady, warm, but powerful. When I was invited to speak at this conference, I wasn't sure if I was the right person. I'm not a celebrity. I'm not a world-famous entrepreneur. But then I realized something important. I am someone who has learned the hard way that your worth is not defined by the people around you. It's defined by you. James's heart began to race as he listened to Sarah's words, each one striking him like a punch to the gut. She wasn't speaking to the crowd. She was speaking to herself, to the woman she had become, and to him. I spent years of my life as someone's wife, someone's partner. I dedicated myself entirely to another person, losing sight of who I was in the process. I thought that my worth was tied to the approval of others, that I was only valuable if I was needed. But I've learned that that's not true. I am enough, just as I am. I don't need anyone's approval to know my worth. I don't need anyone to complete me because I am already whole. James's breath hitched in his throat. Her words felt like a harsh, painful truth, and yet he couldn't look away. Every word Sarah spoke was a revelation, a painful reminder of how deeply he had neglected her, how blind he had been to her pain and to the woman she had always been. He had been so focused on himself, so consumed with his own success, that he had never once asked Sarah what she needed, what she wanted, or what she dreamed of. He had taken for granted the quiet love she had offered him without ever asking for anything in return. As she continued, James felt a deep, gut-wrenching guilt wash over him. He hadn't seen it before, hadn't recognized the subtle signs of her growing resentment, of her inner struggle. He had assumed that because Sarah was quiet, because she was patient, she didn't have a voice. He had failed to see that she had always had one, that she was capable of so much more than he had ever given her credit for. It took me years to realize that the person I had to become was not someone else's idea of who I should be, Sarah said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. It took me time to realize that I had to be true to myself. I am more than a wife, more than a partner. I am a woman with dreams, with passions, with goals of my own, and I am proud of who I've become. Each word pierced James's heart like a dagger. He had been so focused on his career, his ambitions, his empire, that he had forgotten the most important thing in his life, Sarah. She wasn't just his wife, she was an individual, a person with her own dreams, her own life, her own identity, and he had neglected that. He had suffocated it with his own need for control, his own selfishness. When Sarah finished speaking, the room erupted into applause. James could barely hear the noise, his mind overwhelmed by the realization that the woman he had taken for granted was now someone else entirely. She had found herself, found her power, her voice, and was inspiring others to do the same. She no longer needed him to define her, to validate her, to make her feel worthy. She had done it on her own. And now she was standing before him as the woman he had never truly known, strong, independent, unapologetically herself. As the crowd continued to cheer, James stood motionless, his heart heavy with regret. He had been so focused on his own ambitions that he had neglected the one person who had always been by his side, the one person who had always believed in him. And now she was no longer the woman he had taken for granted. She was Sarah, the woman who had found her strength, who had learned to stand on her own 2 feet, and who no longer needed him. For the first time in his life, James felt small. His once dominant ego, the very thing that had driven him to success, shattered into 1,000 pieces. He was nothing compared to the woman standing before him, the woman he had failed. And the realization struck him like a ton of bricks. He had lost her. Not because of his career, not because of his success, but because he had never truly seen her, never truly understood her. And now it was too late. As the applause died down, Sarah stepped down from the stage, her face alight with the joy of knowing she had done something important, something meaningful. She didn't look at James as she passed him by, her eyes forward, her steps sure and steady. She was no longer the woman who had needed him. She was the woman who had found her own path, who had reclaimed her life, and who no longer needed anyone to tell her she was enough. And James, he was left standing in the shadows, heartbroken, realizing that the woman he had once taken for granted had found the strength to walk away. And that, perhaps, was the most beautiful thing of all. The sound of the audience's applause still lingered in the air as James made his way backstage. The crowd's cheers had faded, but the weight in his chest had only grown heavier. Sarah was still there, her presence like a bright flame that was both a comfort and a reminder of his own inadequacies. He had come to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but what if it was too late? What if the woman he had once loved was now beyond his reach, beyond his understanding? As he approached the backstage area, his legs felt like lead. Every step seemed to echo in the emptiness around him, and the realization that Sarah had truly transformed, that she had found herself, made him feel small. He wasn't sure what he expected, but when he saw her, standing alone near a dressing room mirror, the calm and composed woman she had become seemed so distant from the one he had known. She was not the woman who had waited for his attention. She was the woman who no longer needed him. Her back was to him as he stood in the doorway, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment, he hesitated. What could he possibly say that would make a difference now? His heart ached, knowing that every mistake he had made had led them here, and that his arrogance, his neglect, had driven the woman he loved away. She must have sensed his presence, because she turned to face him. Her expression was soft, her eyes a little tired, but there was a strength in her gaze that made James's heart skip a beat. There was no anger in her eyes, only a quiet, knowing look that seemed to pierce straight through him. For a brief moment he could have sworn she was reading him, as though she had already known what he was going to say before he even opened his mouth. "Sarah," he started, his voice shaking as he spoke her name. The words were harder to say than he had imagined, but they had to be said. He could no longer avoid the truth. "I'm so sorry, I was blind. I didn't see what I had until it was gone. I took you for granted, and I failed you in every way possible. Please forgive me. I was wrong." The words felt like a weight lifting off his chest, but they were also suffused with a deep sorrow. He had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed, as he did in that moment. The man who had spent years hiding behind his success and ego was now standing before the woman he had hurt, asking for something that felt almost impossible to get: forgiveness. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She stood there looking at him with an expression that was both gentle and knowing. It was as if she could see the struggle in him, the depth of his regret. Her silence stretched on, and James's heart thudded in his chest, his nerves fraying with each passing second. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice soft and steady. "James," she said gently, her words catching in his heart like a tender embrace. "You were never the problem." James blinked in surprise, unable to believe what he was hearing. He had expected anger, bitterness, anything but this calm understanding. He had failed her so many times, and yet here she was, telling him he hadn't been the root cause of their pain. I don't understand," he muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "I hurt you. I ignored you. I didn't appreciate you." He took a step closer, his heart filled with confusion and regret. "How could I not be the problem?" Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving his as she gathered her thoughts. There was no anger in her gaze, no accusation, only the clarity of someone who had found peace within themselves. It wasn't just you, James. I let myself live in a place of fear, of doubt. I was so afraid of losing you, of being alone, that I lost sight of who I was. I didn't stand up for myself, and I didn't ask for what I needed. I let my own fears dictate my worth. She paused, as though choosing her words carefully. I didn't see myself clearly, and because of that, I allowed you to treat me in ways that I should never have allowed. James felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted. The weight of her words, so calm and yet so profound, made his heart ache. He had been blinded by his own ambitions and ego, thinking that he was the one who held the power in their relationship. But Sarah's words struck him like a bolt of lightning. She wasn't the one who had failed, it had been the both of them, their failure to see each other for who they truly were. And in that failure, they had allowed their love to wither. I didn't see myself either, Sarah continued, her voice steady, but with an undeniable trace of emotion. I let myself become so wrapped up in being your wife, in being what I thought you needed, that I forgot who I was as a person. I gave so much of myself trying to please you that I lost sight of what was important, being true to myself. But now I've learned that I am enough, just as I am. I don't need anyone's approval or validation, and I needed to see that before I could truly love myself again. James was speechless, his mind racing as he tried to process everything she was saying. It was so clear now, so painfully clear, that Sarah had been lost, just as he had. She had sacrificed so much of herself in their marriage, believing that her worth was tied to his recognition and approval. But somewhere along the way, she had found her own strength. She had discovered her own worth, independent of anyone else's expectations. And he had failed to see it. He had failed to see her. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice trembling, "I never saw you. I never truly saw you for who you were. I was so focused on myself, on what I wanted, that I couldn't see the woman you were becoming. I was too selfish, too blind." Sarah smiled softly, her eyes filled with both compassion and strength. "It's not just your fault, James. I played a part in this too. I let fear rule me, and I let myself shrink. But I don't want to live like that anymore. I'm not going back to that place. I've learned to love myself, to trust myself, and to stand up for myself. And that is something I can't give up." For a long moment, the two of them stood in silence, the weight of their past hanging between them, but also something else, something lighter, more hopeful. James didn't know what the future held for them, or if there was a way back to what they once had. But standing here, with Sarah in front of him, he knew one thing for certain. He had a long road ahead of him if he truly wanted to make amends. But for the first time in years, he was willing to walk that road, no matter how difficult it might be. "I understand," he said finally, his voice filled with a newfound resolve. "I'm sorry, Sarah. And I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you that I'm worthy of your love again, but I know now that I can't do it if you don't want it. I need to respect who you are, who you've become." Sarah nodded, her eyes softening, but her smile still unwavering. "I know you will, James. I see the change in you, and that's all I can ask for." They stood there for a while, each lost in their own thoughts, but in that moment, it didn't matter. For the first time in a long time, there was peace between them, an understanding that no matter what happened next, they both knew that love could not exist without respect, and with that, they both knew that the path forward, while uncertain, held the possibility of healing and growth for both of them. The road to rebuilding their relationship wasn't an easy one, but it was one they chose to walk together, side by side. James and Sarah had both learned invaluable lessons about themselves and their marriage, and though their journey wasn't without its setbacks, the love they shared was stronger than ever before. In the beginning, it felt strange. The silence that had once been a constant companion in their home was replaced by meaningful conversations, moments of understanding, and long, heartfelt talks. It wasn't the kind of rebuilding that happened overnight, but with each passing day, they grew closer. They learned to communicate not just with words, but with empathy, listening to each other in a way they hadn't before. The first step toward healing came when they made the decision to seek professional help. They started attending marriage counseling together. At first, James was hesitant. He had always thought of himself as someone who could solve his own problems, someone who didn't need outside intervention. But as the sessions progressed, he realized how much he had been missing. The counselor helped them uncover the deeper issues that had caused the cracks in their relationship, issues that had been there long before Sarah had left. It wasn't just about neglect. It was about not truly understanding each other's needs, desires, and fears. In counseling, James was forced to confront the painful truths about himself. He had been so wrapped up in his career and personal ambitions that he had neglected Sarah's emotional needs. He had never fully understood the depth of her loneliness or the quiet strength that she had carried with her for years. He had been so focused on his own goals that he didn't notice how she had silently slipped away from him, emotionally and mentally. The process of unpacking his own selfishness was uncomfortable, but it was necessary. And with each painful realization, he found himself becoming a more aware and sensitive partner. Sarah, too, had her own realizations. The counseling sessions allowed her to reflect on how she had allowed herself to shrink, to put everyone else's needs ahead of her own. She had been so afraid of rocking the boat, of losing the love she thought she needed, that she had given up pieces of herself without realizing it. But in therapy, Sarah found her voice again. She learned how to set healthy boundaries, how to stand up for herself, and how to communicate her needs without fear. It wasn't easy. Breaking old patterns of behavior and thought never is. But Sarah was determined to reclaim her sense of self and rebuild a relationship that was not just about survival, but about growth and mutual respect. They also rediscovered the joy of spending time together. The busy days of work and endless responsibilities no longer dominated their lives. They made time for each other again. Whether it was a quiet dinner at home or a spontaneous weekend getaway, James and Sarah began to reconnect on a deeper level. They laughed more, played more, and enjoyed each other's company in a way that felt fresh and new. It wasn't about grand gestures or extravagant dates. It was about the little moments, the simple joys of being with someone who truly saw you and appreciated you. James started to understand that love wasn't about possession or dependence. It was about partnership. He learned that Sarah didn't need him to complete her. She was already whole. But what they shared was a choice, a commitment to walk through life together, supporting and encouraging each other along the way. He didn't need to be her savior. He needed to be her equal, her partner, and her biggest supporter. This realization was transformative for James. He had spent years thinking that love meant control, that he had to be the one to fix everything. But now he understood that love meant freedom. It meant letting the other person grow and thrive, just as much as it meant growing and thriving together. For Sarah, it was a beautiful revelation to realize that she didn't need to sacrifice herself for love. She had always been the one who put others first, but now she saw that she could be her own person, strong, independent, and capable of standing on her own, while still sharing her life with someone else. She had learned that love was not about losing yourself. It was about finding someone who could encourage you to be the best version of yourself. And that's exactly what James was becoming. A partner who saw her as a whole person, not just as someone who existed in relation to him. They also worked hard on their emotional intimacy. There were moments when old habits crept back in, when James was too busy with work, or Sarah felt the weight of old fears. But they learned how to address those moments with understanding instead of blame. They had learned to approach conflict not as adversaries, but as teammates. They learned how to communicate without attacking, how to listen without interrupting, and how to be vulnerable with each other without fear of rejection. They became experts in giving each other space to be imperfect, but also in supporting each other in becoming better versions of themselves, and slowly they started to trust again. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight, and it took time for both of them to feel fully secure in their relationship once more. But with every small victory, with every moment of honesty, their trust grew stronger. Sarah no longer felt the need to hide her emotions or suppress her needs. She knew that James had her back, and he knew that she had his. It was a slow and steady process, but it was worth it. Their love began to feel different. It wasn't about romanticized ideals or unrealistic expectations. It was about choosing each other every day, not because they needed to, but because they wanted to. Their love was built on a foundation of mutual respect, understanding, and a deep appreciation for the unique individuals they both were. Their marriage, once on the brink of collapse, became something far stronger than it had ever been. It was no longer defined by the struggles they had endured, but by the growth they had experienced together. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that made all the difference. They had learned the true meaning of partnership, and as they moved forward, they both knew that their love wasn't just something that happened by chance. It was something they had both worked for, something they had both chosen, and that, more than anything else, was what made their new beginning so beautiful. It was a love built not on the idea of needing the other person to complete them, but on the joy of choosing to walk through life together, each of them whole, strong, and free. They had discovered that a strong marriage isn't just about surviving the tough times. It's about growing through them, learning from them, and using them as a foundation for something even more beautiful. As they looked ahead to their future, James and Sarah knew that challenges would come and life would continue to test them. But they were no longer afraid. They had each other, and they had the tools to face whatever came their way. More importantly, they had learned that love, when it's built on mutual respect and genuine care, is not something that just happens. It's something you create, day by day, with patience, understanding, and a whole lot of heart. James and Sarah's journey wasn't just one of personal redemption or marital reconciliation. Their story held within it a deeper, more profound message, one that transcended their relationship and reached into the fabric of society itself. As they navigated the complexities of their marriage, they unknowingly mirrored the broader struggles we face as a society, struggles that require introspection, change, and a commitment to justice. At its core, their story revealed a truth that all too often goes ignored. It's far too easy to take others for granted. This is something James learned painfully. For years, he had taken Sarah's presence in his life as a given, assuming she would always be there, quietly supporting him. He took her loyalty and love for granted, never fully appreciating the strength she brought to their relationship. But when Sarah left, James was faced with the stark reality of his neglect. The very woman who had always stood by him was gone, and with her departure came a revelation, a harsh but necessary awakening. Sarah's absence was more than just an emotional void for James. It symbolized a broader issue that is prevalent in society. People often take others for granted, not just in relationships, but in every facet of life. This disregard doesn't stop at personal boundaries. It extends into systemic structures. Many people, particularly those who are marginalized based on their race, gender, or socioeconomic status, experience this on a larger scale. They are overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed simply because of who they are. The same blind spot that James had for Sarah was mirrored in the way society disregards and undervalues entire groups of people. Sarah, for so long, had been invisible in her marriage. She had waited patiently for James to see her, to truly recognize her worth. She had supported him in ways he never acknowledged, believing that her love would be enough to keep their bond intact. But when she left, she did more than walk away from James. She walked toward herself. She found her voice, her strength, and her purpose outside the confines of a relationship that had stifled her growth. Sarah became a living testament to the fact that every individual, regardless of their circumstances, deserves to be seen and valued for who they truly are. In many ways, Sarah's personal growth mirrored the struggles of marginalized individuals in society. People who are constantly overlooked, whether due to race, gender, or social class, often find themselves in situations where they must fight to be heard. Just as Sarah fought for her own recognition, countless others have fought for equal opportunities, fair treatment, and the right to exist without fear of prejudice or discrimination. The challenges Sarah faced in her marriage, feeling unseen, unheard, and undervalued, were not isolated to her. They reflect a much broader issue that affects so many people in society who are denied the dignity and respect they deserve because of factors they cannot control. Through Sarah's journey, James learned something critical about himself and about society at large. It's not enough to simply say we respect and love others. Respect must be demonstrated through action. Too often, society says that all people are equal, but then acts in ways that tell a different story. It's not enough to simply say, I don't see color, or I'm not racist. True respect means recognizing the humanity in everyone, acknowledging their experiences, and treating them with the dignity they deserve. It requires action, not just words. For James, this meant confronting his own biases and blind spots. He had been so consumed by his own world that he failed to see the toll his behavior had taken on Sarah. He assumed that she would always be there, supporting him, and never truly asked if she was okay, never considered if she was happy or fulfilled. This kind of complacency is dangerous, not just in relationships, but in society as well. It's easy to assume that people are doing fine, that they don't need anything from us, when in reality, they may be silently struggling. James learned this the hard way, realizing that his neglect had caused irreparable harm, not just to his marriage, but to his own understanding of what love and partnership truly mean. When James first attended the conference to see Sarah speak, he was confronted by a version of her he had never fully recognized, confident, independent, and unapologetically herself. Her words, spoken to a room full of women who had experienced similar struggles, cut to the core of his being. It took me years to realize my worth. I was someone's wife, someone's partner, but I forgot to be myself. Now, I stand here as a woman who knows she is enough, not because of anyone's approval, but because I am enough just as I am. In those words, James heard not just Sarah's voice, but the voices of so many people who have been told they are not enough, whether because of their race, their gender, or their background. Her message was universal, powerful, and painfully timely. As James listened, he was forced to face a truth he had long ignored. He had taken Sarah for granted, but he also realized something even more significant. Society as a whole often takes people for granted based on superficial judgments. People are seen not for who they are, but for the labels others place on them. Labels based on race, gender, social class, or even appearance. This systemic problem runs deep in society, creating barriers for people who are already marginalized, further isolating them and making it harder for them to thrive. This realization sparked a shift within James. He understood that in order to truly rebuild his relationship with Sarah, he needed to make things right, not just through words, but through consistent actions. He had to show her, through his behavior and choices, that he respected her, valued her, and appreciated everything she had done for him. Similarly, in society, we must go beyond simply acknowledging the struggles of marginalized groups. We must actively work to dismantle the systems that perpetuate inequality and create spaces where everyone is treated with fairness and respect. After the conference, when James apologized to Sarah, it was not just a personal apology. It was a reflection of the changes he had begun to make within himself. He was no longer the man who took Sarah for granted, nor was he the man who thought he could control or fix everything. He was now someone who recognized the importance of seeing the humanity in others, of respecting their worth, and of acknowledging that every individual deserves to be treated with dignity. His apology was not just for Sarah, it was for all the people he had overlooked in his life, all the people whose worth he had failed to recognize, whether personally or in a broader societal sense. As Sarah listened to his apology, she could feel the sincerity in his words, but she also knew that words alone would not heal the wounds they had both endured. It would take time, effort, and patience to rebuild their trust. Just as their marriage required work, so too did society. Change doesn't happen overnight. It requires consistent effort, self-reflection, and a commitment to doing better each day. In the end, James and Sarah found a new beginning, not just in their marriage, but in their own personal growth. Sarah, having rediscovered her worth, no longer felt the need to be defined by anyone else's expectations. James, having learned to listen and respect her, was now a partner who saw her as an equal. Their love was no longer about need. It was about choice, mutual respect, and understanding. Their journey together had shown them that love, whether in a marriage or society, requires constant work and active participation. It isn't enough to simply claim to love or respect someone. You have to show it every single day. Their story is a powerful lesson for us all. It's a reminder that we must never take each other for granted, that we must always strive to understand, appreciate, and respect those around us. It's a call to action for a society that is too often blind to the needs of others, too quick to make assumptions based on race, gender, or background. If we want to build a better world, we must start by seeing each other, truly seeing each other, not through the lens of our own biases or prejudices, but with empathy and understanding. Only then can we create a world where everyone is valued, respected, and able to thrive. The story of James and Sarah teaches us that relationships, whether personal or societal, are not built on assumptions, neglect, or indifference. They are built on respect, understanding, and the willingness to see and appreciate each other as human beings. In the end, it is through these values that we can overcome the divisions that exist in our world, building a society where love, kindness, and justice prevail for all. We can all do better to listen, appreciate, and stand up for those who might feel forgotten or underestimated. This story reminds us that growth in relationships and society often starts with the courage to change.